If someone had told me my own daughter-in-law would slap me just 3 days after the wedding, I would have laughed. But it happened. The real shock wasn't the slap. It was what my son did while I stood there in tears. That's when I decided I would never let either of them forget what they had done. I want you to sit with me for a while because this is not a short story, and I am not going to rush through it just to get to the part where you gasp. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 71 years old. I have raised one son on my own since he was 4 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood everything there was to understand about love, about patience, and about what a mother is supposed to swallow for the sake of peace in her own house. 3 weeks ago, on the third morning after my son's wedding, I learned that I still had a great deal to learn. Let me start before the slap, because if I start with the slap, you will only see Harlow's hand and you will miss everything that built up to it. And I need you to see everything. I need you to walk through my kitchen with me, smell the coffee, hear the clock on the wall, and understand exactly who was sitting at that table when it happened. My son's name is Corey Whitfield. He was born on a February morning so cold that the nurses joked the whole hospital wing lost heat trying to warm the delivery room. His father left before Corey turned 4, packed 2 suitcases while I was at the grocery store, and by the time I got home, there was a note on the counter and a ring on top of it, like he was returning something he'd borrowed. I won't spend long on that part of my life because it isn't the story. I promised you, but I tell you this much so you understand the kind of mother I became after that morning. I became the kind of mother who worked 2 jobs and never once let my son see me cry in front of him. I became the kind of mother who sewed name tags into his gym clothes by hand because the iron-on ones kept falling off, who sat up nights helping him sound out words from a library book with a torn cover, who drove 40 minutes each way twice a week so he could take trumpet lessons from a retired music teacher who only charged $8 a session because she liked how hard he tried. I am telling you this because I want you to understand something. Before we go any further, Corey was not raised by a weak woman. He was not raised in a house where silence was normal. He was raised watching his mother speak up, stand tall, and never once let anyone walk over her, which is exactly why what happened at that breakfast table cut so much deeper than the sting on my cheek. Corey met Harlow Bennett almost 2 years ago at a work conference in another city. He called me the same night, practically breathless, and told me he'd met a woman who actually listened when he talked, which struck me as a strange thing to be excited about until I understood, slowly over the following months, that it meant she performed listening extremely well in short bursts and then made every long conversation about herself. I didn't say that to him then. A mother learns when to speak and when to let her son find things out on his own, even when she already knows the ending of the book he's only just started reading. I met Harlow for the first time 4 months into their relationship. At a dinner Corey arranged at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with candles stuck in old wine bottles and a menu that doesn't list prices next to the entrees, which I've always found to be a strange kind of politeness, as if not seeing the number changes what you'll owe at the end of the night. Harlow arrived 20 minutes late in a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And the first thing she said to me, before hello, before nice to meet you, was, "Corey didn't tell me you were this old." I laughed it off. Corey laughed it off too, nervously, the way he used to laugh as a boy when he'd broken something and was hoping I hadn't noticed yet. I told myself it was nerves. New people say strange things when they're nervous. I have said strange things myself when I was nervous, so I gave her the benefit of every doubt I had in my body that night. And I kept giving her that benefit for the better part of 2 years. Because that is what you do when your only child loves someone. You make room. You make room even when the room doesn't want to be made. Over those 2 years, I watched a pattern form that I chose, again and again, not to name out loud. Harlow was warm in front of groups and cold in private. She would compliment my cooking at a family dinner with 6 people watching and then tell Corey afterward when she thought I couldn't hear through the thin wall between my kitchen and my dining room that my food was heavy and that she didn't understand how it hadn't given him high cholesterol yet. She would hug me at Christmas in front of her own family, squeezing tight enough that her cousins would comment on how close we seemed. And then 2 days later, text Corey to say she didn't think it was necessary for me to come to Easter because big family things made her anxious. Corey never told me about these smaller things directly. I found out about most of them much later. In the weeks after the wedding, when the truth started leaking out of him the way water leaks out of a cracked dam, slow at first and then all at once. But even without knowing the specifics, I felt the shape of it. A mother always feels the shape of it before she has the words for it. I want to be fair to Harlow here, because fairness is something I've tried to practice my whole life, even when it costs me something. And I think it's important you understand she wasn't cruel to everyone. She was, by most accounts, charming. She held a good job at a marketing firm downtown. She had a wide circle of friends who adored her. She posted photographs online of herself volunteering at animal shelters and organizing donation drives for a women's shelter 2 towns over. People who only knew Harlow from a distance would have told you she was warm, generous, full of light. I think that's actually the part that took me the longest to understand. It wasn't that Harlow was a villain in every room. It was that she had decided somewhere early on that I specifically did not deserve the version of her that everyone else got to see. And Corey, my sweet, conflict-avoidant son, who has spent his whole life terrified of anyone being upset with him, decided the easiest path forward was to let that decision stand without a fight. The wedding itself was lovely, if I'm being honest. And I don't want to pretend otherwise just because of what came after. It was held in a garden venue outside the city. String lights hung between old oak trees, a jazz trio playing during the cocktail hour, and my son standing at the altar in a suit I'd helped him pick out 3 months earlier, looking so much like his father used to look, and yet so much kinder in the eyes, that I had to excuse myself to the restroom halfway through the ceremony just to catch my breath. Harlow walked down the aisle in a dress that made the whole room go quiet, and when she reached Corey and took his hands, I watched my son's face open up in a way I hadn't seen since he was small, since before the world had taught him to guard himself. For one afternoon, I let myself believe that whatever coldness I'd felt from her over the past 2 years was simply nerves, simply the pressure of new family, simply growing pains that would smooth out once the wedding stress was behind us. I danced with my son at his reception. I gave a toast that made half the room cry, including, notably, Harlow's own mother, who hugged me afterward and told me I'd raised a good man. I went home that night with my feet aching and my good shoes and my heart, for the first time in longer than I could remember, feeling completely, foolishly full. The newlyweds moved into my house for what was supposed to be a short stretch, 6 to 8 weeks, while renovations finished on the home they'd bought together 2 streets over. This had been my idea originally. I have a large house, 4 bedrooms, more space than one woman needs. And when Corey mentioned the renovation delays, I offered before he even had to ask, because that is what mothers do. And because I like the idea of a few more weeks with my son under my roof before he belonged fully to someone else's home. Harlow had seemed reluctant when Corey brought it up, but she agreed. And I told myself that reluctance was reasonable too. Nobody wants to live with their mother-in-law, even temporarily, even in the nicest house with the nicest intentions. I understood that. I made up the guest room with fresh linens, cleared out a closet, bought a new coffee maker because Harlow had mentioned once that she preferred a French press to my old drip machine. And I told myself I was going to make these weeks as easy and pleasant as I possibly could. Day 1 was fine. Quiet, a little stiff, but fine. Harlow unpacked her things while Corey and I carried boxes in from the car. And that evening, the three of us sat in my living room and watched a movie. Harlow picked something with subtitles that I didn't fully follow but pretended to enjoy because Corey seemed happy that his wife and his mother were in the same room, laughing at the same jokes, existing peacefully in the same air. I remember thinking as I climbed into bed that night that maybe I'd been wrong about the coldness. Maybe married life would soften her. Maybe living close together would let her see me the way I actually was, instead of whatever version of me she'd built in her head over the 2 years of dinners and holidays. Day 2 was when the first crack showed, though I didn't recognize it as a crack at the time. I recognized it as a crack only in hindsight, the way you only notice the first hairline fracture in a window after the whole pane has shattered and you're standing there picking through the pieces trying to figure out where it started. That morning I'd made a full breakfast, eggs, sausage, biscuits from scratch, the kind of spread I used to make on Sunday mornings when Corey was a boy and we didn't have much money, but I wanted him to start the week feeling like he did. Harlow came down in a silk robe, looked at the table, and said, "Oh, I don't really do heavy breakfasts, but thank you for thinking of me," in a tone so pleasant that it took me a full 10 seconds to register that she just called my cooking, and by extension, a piece of my care for my son, something she needed to be protected from. Corey, sitting across the table, said nothing. He ate his eggs. He complimented the biscuits. He did not once look up to see whether that comment had landed on me the way it landed, which was somewhere just beneath the ribs, in the same place all the small comments over the past 2 years had been quietly landing one on top of another, building a weight I hadn't fully measured until I felt it settle that morning. I am telling you about day 2 in this much detail because I want you to understand that day 3, the morning I've promised to tell you about, the morning of the slap did not come out of nowhere. It came at the end of a slow buildup that I had spent 2 years and then 2 additional days, choosing to absorb quietly because I loved my son, because I wanted his marriage to work, because somewhere in my heart, I still believed that love and patience could soften almost anything given enough time. I want you to understand that I am not a woman who slaps easily out of someone's memory. I am a woman who gives second chances, third chances, fourth chances, long past the point where most people would have stopped counting. So when I tell you what happened on that third morning, I need you to know it landed on ground that had already been worn thin by 2 years of small, quiet erosions that nobody else in the family had been paying close enough attention to notice. The third morning started ordinary enough. I woke before sunrise the way I have for 40 years, made coffee, and stood at my kitchen window watching the sky turn from navy to gray to that pale gold color it takes on right before the sun clears the tree line. I decided that morning to make something lighter, out of respect for what Harlow had said the day before. Toast, fresh fruit, scrambled eggs done soft, a pot of tea instead of coffee, since I remembered her mentioning once that coffee made her jittery before her morning run. I want you to understand that I was still trying. Even after 2 years of small cuts, even after the comment about heavy breakfasts, I was still standing in my own kitchen at 6:30 in the morning trying to figure out how to make this woman feel welcomed in the house I had opened to her. That is who I was 3 weeks ago. I tell you that so you understand exactly how far the ground shifted beneath me by the time that breakfast ended. Corey came down first, dressed for work, kissed my cheek the way he's done every morning since he was old enough to reach it, and sat at the table scrolling through something on his phone. Harlow came down a few minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, wearing workout clothes for the run she took most mornings before her job started. She sat down across from me, looked at the plate I set in front of her, and for a moment I thought everything was going to be fine. She even said thank you. I remember feeling a small, foolish flicker of relief at that thank you. The kind of relief you feel when a storm you were bracing for seems to pass just north of your house instead. Then she picked up her phone, and I watched her face change as she read something on the screen. I didn't know what it was at the time. I found out later, much later, that it was a message from her mother, a woman named Denise, who I'd only met a handful of times, but who I'd always sensed held a particular kind of influence over her daughter. The kind of influence that comes from decades of telling a child exactly what she wants to hear about herself. Whatever that message said, it soured Harlow's mood in the space of about 4 seconds. And when she set the phone down, she looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not coldness, not the polite, distant chill I'd grown used to. Something sharper. "Did you go into our room yesterday?" she asked me. I told her I hadn't because I hadn't. I had no reason to. My son and his wife had the guest room for 6 to 8 weeks, and I had given them their privacy the entire time. The same way I would give any adult child their privacy. The same way my own mother had given me mine when I was newly married and living under her roof for a summer while my late husband and I saved for our first apartment. I told Harlow calmly that I hadn't been in the room, and I asked her why she was asking. "Because one of my rings is missing," she said, "and nobody else has been in that room but you since Corey's at work all day." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment the way I had to sit with it that morning, because I don't think the accusation itself is what stunned me most. People misplace things. People panic when they misplace something valuable, and they look for someone to blame before they've even finished looking under the bed. I understood that, and I told her gently that I was sure the ring would turn up somewhere in the room, that these things always did, and that I would help her look for it after breakfast if she wanted. I offered this in good faith. I offered this the way I've offered good faith to this woman for 2 straight years. Harlow's face didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further, and she said, "You know, ever since we moved in here, things have felt off. Corey said you used to go through his things when he was a teenager, too, reading his messages, going through his drawers. I guess it runs in the family." I set my fork down very slowly. I looked at my son. I want you to understand that in 26 years of raising Corey Whitfield alone, I never once read a message that wasn't meant for me, never once searched a drawer that wasn't mine to search, never once violated the privacy of the one person in this world I trusted more than anyone else. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to say, "Mom would never do that," or even just, "Harlow, that's not fair." And instead, my son looked down at his plate and said nothing. He did not defend me. He did not correct the record. He simply sat there, a grown man of 28 years old, in the kitchen where I taught him to tie his shoes, and let a lie about his own mother sit in. The air between us without a single word to knock it down. That silence, I think, is what gave Harlow the room to keep going. Silence from the person you love most tells you, more clearly than any words could, exactly how much space you're allowed to take up. And Harlow took it. "I really think you owe me an apology," she said, "for whatever you did with that ring. It was my grandmother's. It's not replaceable." I told her, still calm, still trying to hold the shape of the piece I'd been building for 2 years, that I understood how upsetting it was to lose something with sentimental value, but that I had not touched her belongings, and I would not be apologizing for something I hadn't done. I said it kindly. I said it the way you'd speak to explain a simple fact to someone who was clearly upset and looking for somewhere to put that upset. I did not raise my voice. I did not so much as push my chair back from the table. Harlow stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against my kitchen floor, the sound of it sharp enough that I felt it in my teeth. "You are unbelievable," she said. "You've hated me since the day we met, and you've been pretending this whole time. And now you're going to stand there and lie to my face in your own house." I told her I had never hated her, that I had welcomed her into this family with everything I had, that I had made her breakfast that very morning in an effort to make her feel comfortable. And that is when it happened. I watched her hand come up before I fully understood what was happening. And then I felt the sting of her palm across my left cheek, hard enough that my head turned with the force of it, hard enough that the Sound of it cracked through my kitchen, the way a dropped plate cracks against tile. The kitchen went silent after that in a way I don't think I can fully describe to you. My ears were ringing faintly, my cheek was hot, and for one long moment nobody moved. I did not cry. I want you to know that because I think it matters. I did not cry and I did not raise my hand back, though something in me, something old and sharp and protective, wanted to. I simply stood there, one hand rising slowly to touch my own cheek, staring at this woman who had just struck me in my own kitchen, in the house I'd raised her husband in, over a ring I had never seen or touched in my life. And then I looked at my son. Corey was still sitting at the table. His fork was still in his hand, resting against the edge of his plate. His face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open, and for one heartbeat, one single heartbeat, I thought he was about to stand up, about to do the thing a son is supposed to do when someone strikes his mother in front of him. Instead, he set his fork down, looked between the two of us, and said, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, "Harlow, maybe you should go upstairs and cool off." That was it. That was the entire defense my son offered me. Not a word about what had just happened to my face. Not a word about the accusation that had preceded it. Just a request for his wife to remove herself from the room, delivered in the gentlest, most conflict-avoidant tone possible, as though what had happened was an inconvenient disagreement between two equally reasonable parties rather than an assault on his own mother in her own home. Harlow left the kitchen. I heard her footsteps go up the stairs, heard the guest room door close, not slammed, just closed with a kind of composed finality that told me she did not feel she had done anything requiring urgency or shame. And then it was just me and my son, standing in a kitchen that smelled like scrambled eggs and fresh tea, my cheeks still burning, my hand still resting against it. "Mom," Corey said finally, "I'm sorry. She's just stressed about the wedding stuff still. The thank you cards, the ring being missing. Everything's just a lot right now." I looked at my son for a long moment before I spoke. I looked at the boy I had raised alone, the boy whose gym clothes I'd sewn name tags into, whose trumpet lessons I'd driven 40 minutes each way to fund, whose face at the wedding altar had made me cry from happiness only 3 days earlier. And I asked him one question. I asked, "Did you see what she just did to me?" He nodded. He said he saw it. And then he said the words that I don't think I will ever fully stop hearing when I close my eyes at night. He said, "I know, Mom, but she didn't mean it like that. Can we just let it go? I don't want this to be a whole thing." I did not answer him right away. I picked my plate up off the table, scraped my untouched breakfast into the trash, and washed the dish in silence while my son stood in the doorway of my kitchen, not quite leaving, not quite staying, caught in the exact kind of paralysis that had let this happen in the first place. When I finished washing the dish, I dried my hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle, the same towel that had hung there for 6 years, and I told my son in a voice steadier than I felt that I needed some time alone that morning and that I would talk to him later. He left for work 20 minutes after that. I heard his car pull out of the driveway, and I stood in my kitchen alone, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and I finally let myself sit down at the table in the chair I always sat in, and I put my face in my hands. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I cried in my own house with no one there to see it, over a slap that stung far less than the silence that had followed it. I did not tell anyone what happened that first day, not my sister, not my closest friend of 30 years, not even the neighbor who has coffee with me most Tuesday mornings and who can usually read my face better than I can read it myself. I told no one because in the hours right after it happened, I still believed foolishly that this was something that could be fixed quietly, privately, within the walls of my own family, without ever needing to become a story other people whispered about. I have learned since then that silence protects the person who caused the harm far more than it protects the person who received it. But on that first day, I did not know that yet. I only knew that my cheek had stopped stinging by noon, and that a different kind of ache had settled in somewhere much deeper, somewhere that wouldn't fade by evening the way the mark on my skin did. Harlow did not come downstairs again that day. I heard her moving around in the guest room throughout the afternoon, heard her voice on the phone at one point, low and fast, though I couldn't make out the words through the wall, and I made a private decision standing in my own hallway that I would not go up and knock on that door. I would not be the one to smooth this over. I had spent 2 years smoothing things over, absorbing small cuts, telling myself that patience was a virtue and that time healed misunderstandings between women who loved the same man. I decided, standing in that hallway, with my hand resting briefly against the banister my late husband had installed 30 years earlier, that I was done being the one who reached first. Corey came home from work that evening carrying a bouquet of grocery store flowers, the cheap kind wrapped in plastic with a rubber band around the stems. And for one confused moment, I thought they might be for me. They were not. Walked past the kitchen where I was sitting, went upstairs, and I heard him knock softly on the guest room door, heard it open, heard a muffled exchange of voices I couldn't decode. He came down 40 minutes later alone and sat across from me at the kitchen table where, 12 hours earlier, his wife had struck me across the face. She feels really bad, he told me. She said the stress of everything just got to her. The move, the ring, her mom calling about the thank you cards. She wants to apologize tomorrow when she's calmer. I asked him whether he felt bad. I asked him this directly, looking him in the eye the way I used to when he was 7 years old. And I needed to know whether he was telling me the truth about who broke the lamp in the living room. My son, my grown son, looked down at the table and told me that of course he felt bad, that he hated seeing me upset, that he just didn't want the whole thing to spiral into something that ruined the family before it even had a chance to settle into its new shape. He used the word spiral, the way people use words they've picked up from someone else, a word that didn't sound like it belonged to him. And later I would learn that it was, in fact, one of Harlow's words, one she used often to describe any situation where someone else's feelings threatened to become inconvenient to her. I told my son that evening calmly that I would accept an apology if one was offered, but that an apology without any real understanding of what had happened wasn't worth much to me. He nodded like he understood. I don't think at that point he actually did. The apology came the next morning, day 4, if you're keeping count. And I want to describe it to you exactly as it happened, because the shape of an apology tells you almost everything you need to know about whether a person intends to change or whether they simply intend to close a chapter as quickly as possible so the story can move on to the next one. Harlow came down to the kitchen already dressed for work, sat across from me and said, "I'm sorry about yesterday. I was really stressed and I overreacted. I hope we can move past it." That was the entire apology. 14 words delivered without once mentioning what she had actually done, without once using the word slap or hit or hand, without once acknowledging that she had accused me of theft with no evidence before doing it. I sat with that apology the way you sit with a check that's been written for far less than what's owed. I told her gently that I appreciated her saying something and that I hoped moving forward we could find a way to communicate without anyone raising a hand. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand more than what she'd offered. I simply named clearly and calmly what had actually happened so that it existed plainly in the room between us instead of being folded into the vague, comfortable language of yesterday and overreacted. Harlow's jaw tightened slightly when I said it. "I already apologized," she said. "I don't think we need to relive it every time we talk." I told her I wasn't asking to relive it. I was asking to be heard about it once, clearly, and then I would be glad to move forward. She didn't respond to that. She finished her coffee, said goodbye to Corey, who had just come down the stairs, and left for work without looking at me again. Over the following 2 weeks, the house settled into a strange, brittle kind of quiet. Harlow was polite to me in front of Corey and cool to me the moment he left the room, which I had, by that point, come to expect as her natural weather pattern. I threw myself into small tasks around the house, the way I've always done when my mind needed somewhere safe to land. I reorganized the pantry. I repainted the fence along the side yard, a job I'd been putting off for 2 summers. I called my sister finally, on the 10th day, and told her everything. Start to finish, the ring, the accusation, the slap, Corey's silence, the 14-word apology. My sister, whose name is Patricia, and who has never in her life been shy about her opinions, went quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "Margaret, you raised that boy to have a spine. Somebody's convinced him to leave it at the door before he walks into his own house." I didn't know at the time just how right she was or how deliberately that spine had been talked out of him. The ring, as it turned out, was never actually missing. I found this out on day 16 purely by accident while I was vacuuming the guest room during one of the rare afternoons both Corey and Harlow were out of the house. The vacuum caught on something under the edge of the bed skirt, and when I knelt down to free it, I found a small velvet box tucked behind one of the bed legs, clearly having slipped there weeks earlier, likely knocked off the nightstand during the move-in when boxes were being shuffled around the room. Inside was a ring, an old-fashioned one with a small emerald flanked by 2 tiny diamonds, exactly matching the description Harlow had given weeks earlier when she'd stood in my kitchen and accused me of taking it. I sat on the edge of that guest bed for a long time, holding that ring in my palm. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment, because I think honesty matters more than making myself look better than I actually felt. My first instinct was relief, simple and immediate. The kind of relief you feel when a nagging worry turns out to have a mundane explanation. My second instinct, arriving close behind the first, was something closer to grief, because I understood holding that ring that Harlow had never actually believed I stole it. She had known, or at least strongly suspected, that it had simply fallen behind the bed during the chaos of moving boxes in. She had chosen in that moment at the breakfast table to accuse me anyway, because it gave her an opening, a justification, a reason to let something out that had been building in her for 2 years and had nothing at all to do with a piece of jewelry. I did not confront her with the ring that day. I want you to understand this was not weakness. It was strategy. And it was the beginning of the part of this story where I stopped simply absorbing what was happening to me and started paying very close attention instead. I put the ring back exactly where I found it, tucked behind the bed leg, dust and all, and I finished vacuuming the room as though I'd never seen it. I want to explain why, because I know some of you listening might think I should have marched downstairs or called Corey at work or waited by the door for Harlow to come home so I could hold that little velvet box up and demand she explain herself. Believe me, some part of me wanted exactly that. But I have lived 71 years on this earth, and one of the few genuine gifts age gives you, if you let it, is the ability to recognize when confrontation will win you a moment and lose you a war. I did not yet understand the shape of the war I was in. I only understood, standing in that guest room with dust on my knees, that something larger than a missing ring was happening in my house, and that I needed to understand it fully before I moved another piece on the board. So I started paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. Not snooping, not reading messages that weren't mine to read, but simply watching, the way you watch weather roll in across a field, noticing the small shifts in pressure before the storm actually arrives. I noticed that Harlow was on the phone with her mother nearly every evening, always in the guest room with the door mostly closed, always lowering her voice when I passed in the hallway. I noticed that she'd started asking Corey small, seemingly innocent questions at dinner. Questions like, "Doesn't your mom think this house is a lot for one person now?" And has she ever mentioned what she wants to do with it eventually? I noticed that these questions always came when I was in the room but occupied. Washing dishes, stirring a pot, questions designed to sound like idle curiosity, but aimed with a precision that told me they were idle at all. I called my sister Patricia again on day 19 and told her what I'd started noticing. Patricia has always had a sharper eye than mine for this particular kind of maneuvering, mostly because her own late husband's family had tried something similar to her 30 years earlier, circling a piece of property like patient birds long before anyone in the family had died or even gotten sick. Margaret, she told me, you need to find out if that girl knows what your house is worth. And you need to find out fast. Because I promise you, this isn't about a ring. And it was never about a ring. I did some quiet math of my own that week. My house, the one I'd bought with my late husband 34 years ago for a fraction of what it's worth now, sits on nearly an acre in a part of town that had, over the last decade, become unexpectedly desirable, close to a new commuter rail line, close to a school district that families paid extra to live inside of. A realtor friend of mine, a woman named Yvonne, who I'd known since our children were in preschool together, told me over coffee one afternoon that a house like mine, on a lot like mine in this particular pocket of the city, would likely sell for somewhere between $800,000 and $900,000 if I ever chose to put it on the market. I had known my property had appreciated over the years, but I hadn't sat with the actual number in a long time. And hearing it out loud in Yvonne's kitchen made something click into place that I hadn't wanted to see clicking. I began to understand slowly and then all at once. The way understanding often works, that Harlow had likely done this math long before I had. I began to understand that the slap, the accusation, the 14-word apology, the pointed dinner table questions about what I planned to do with the house eventually were not scattered, unconnected incidents. They were pieces of something being built, patiently, in the same way. I had once patiently built a life for my son out of 2 jobs and library books with torn covers. Except what Harlow was building wasn't a life. It was a position. And I was standing without fully realizing it until that week, directly in the middle of the ground she wanted to claim. I want to tell you about a phone call I overheard on day 22, because I think it's the moment everything sharpened into focus for me. I want to be honest that I did not go looking for this conversation. I was in the hallway outside the guest room carrying a stack of clean towels to the linen closet, which sits directly beside that room, and Harlow's voice carried through the door, which had been left open just a crack, wider than she probably realized. "She's not going to live forever, Mom," Harlow was saying, and I understood immediately she was talking to Denise. And Corey's her only kid. It's not like I'm asking for anything crazy. I just think it makes sense for us to be on the deed too, especially since we're basically already living here. There was a pause, presumably while Denise responded, and then Harlow continued, her voice dropping lower, though not quite low enough. I know. I just need to figure out how to bring it up without him getting weird about it. He gets so sensitive about anything involving his mom. I think if I can get her to feel like she owes us something, like she needs us around, it'll be easier to have the conversation. I don't know, maybe I overreacted the other morning. But honestly, it kind of worked. She's been walking on eggshells around me ever since. I stood in that hallway with a stack of warm towels in my arms and felt something in my chest go very still and very clear. The way a lake goes still right before the first hard frost sets in. I want you to hear that sentence again, because I've replayed it in my own mind more times than I can count over these past 3 weeks. She said it kind of worked. She said she'd been walking on eggshells around me ever since. My daughter-in-law had struck me across the face in my own kitchen. Not out of stress, not out of overreaction, but as a calculated, deliberate act meant to establish a dynamic in this house. A dynamic where I would be too afraid of another confrontation to push back on whatever came next. And that what came next apparently was going to be a conversation about putting her and my son on the deed to a house she had lived in for exactly 3 weeks. I did not drop the towels. I did not gasp loud enough to be heard. I finished walking to the linen closet, set the towels down on the shelf exactly the way I always do, corners aligned, and I went downstairs and sat in my own living room for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, feeling something shift inside me that I recognized distantly as the same feeling I'd had the morning I found my late husband's note on the kitchen counter. 40-some years earlier. Not heartbreak this time. Something colder and steadier than heartbreak. Clarity. I did not confront Harlow that day either. I want you to understand, if you take nothing else from this story, that the version of revenge I'm about to describe to you was never about matching cruelty with cruelty. I have never in my life believed that the way to answer someone's ugliness is to become uglier back. What I believed, sitting in that living room on day 22, was that I needed to be smarter than what was being done to me. And that being smarter meant being patient just a little while longer, gathering everything I needed before I let anyone in this house know exactly how much I had already understood. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, a man named Franklin Osei, who had handled my late husband's estate and who I trusted the way you trust very few people outside your own blood. I told him everything, and he listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do. And when I finished, he told me something I have carried with me every day since. He said, "Margaret, the house is yours. It has always been yours. Nobody can put themselves on that deed without your signature. And nothing that's happened gives them any legal claim to it. But you called me because you want to know how to protect yourself from pressure, not paperwork. And that's a different kind of protection." He recommended I update my will and my power of attorney, documents immediately, naming people I trusted completely, so that no amount of pressure applied in my own kitchen could ever put my home or my future in anyone's hands but my own. I did exactly that within the week, quietly, without a word to Corey or Harlow. And I want to tell you that signing those papers in Franklin's office felt like locking a door I hadn't realized had been standing open. The second thing I did was start writing things, dates, conversations, the exact wording of what Harlow had said at breakfast on day 3, the exact wording of the 14-word apology, the exact wording of what I'd overheard through that guest room door. I am not by nature a suspicious woman, and it did not come easily to me to start documenting my own daughter-in-law like I was building a case file. But I had raised a lawyer's kind of caution in myself over the years, without ever meaning to, mostly from watching too many women in my own life get talked out of trusting their own memory of events once someone more confident than them decided to rewrite the story. I was not going to let that happen to me in my own house. The third thing I did, and I think this was the most important thing, was start talking to Corey again, really talking. Not the polite surface exchanges we'd been having since the breakfast, but the kind of talking his father and I used to do before everything fell apart between us all those years ago. I invited him to help me with the fence I was repainting, just the two of us, on a Saturday afternoon while Harlow was out with her friends. And with a paintbrush in his hand and his sleeves rolled up the way they used to be, when he helped me with yard work as a teenager, I asked my son a question I had been waiting 3 weeks to ask him properly. "Corey," I said, "I need you to tell me honestly. Do you think what happened at breakfast that morning was okay?" He was quiet for a long moment, dragging the brush slowly along a fence board. And I let the silence sit there without rushing to fill it, because I wanted to see what he'd do with the space instead of what he'd say if I crowded him with more words. Finally, he set the brush down and looked at me. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I saw something in his face that looked less like avoidance and more like the beginning of real discomfort with himself. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't okay. I've known it wasn't okay since it happened. I just didn't know what to do. And every time I think about bringing it up again, she gets upset. And then I feel like I'm choosing between you and her. And I hate that feeling so much that it's just easier to let it go. I told my son, standing in that yard with paint on our hands, that I understood how hard it feels to be caught between two people you love. I told him I had never once asked him to choose between us and that I never would, but that there was a difference between choosing between two people and choosing whether to tell the truth. I told him that the second one was his responsibility, no matter who it made uncomfortable, and that a marriage built on his silence was not a marriage that was actually going to hold, no matter how many years it lasted. Because somewhere underneath all that quiet, resentment builds exactly the way it had built in me for 3 weeks. I watched something in his face crack open just slightly, the way a window cracks before it finally gives way. And I knew standing there that the ground was finally starting to shift in my favor. I should tell you a little more about myself here, because I think it matters for what comes later in this story. And because I've noticed that people are often quick to imagine a woman my age as either endlessly patient and sweet or bitter and difficult, with very little room allowed for anything more complicated than that. I am neither of those things, or perhaps I am both of those things, depending on the day and the hour. I worked 31 years as a bookkeeper for a family-owned hardware store 2 towns over. The same store from the time I was 26 until the year I retired, watching 3 generations of the same family run that business into the ground and then somehow rebuild it twice. I know how to read a ledger. I know how to spot when numbers don't add up, when someone's quietly skimming, when a pattern that looks random on the surface actually has a very deliberate shape underneath it if you're patient, enough to lay all the entries out side by side. I bring this up because I think it explains something about how I handled the weeks that followed that overheard phone call. I did not react. I documented. I did not confront. I laid the entries out side by side and waited until the pattern was undeniable, not just to me, but to anyone who looked at it honestly. There is also something else you should know about me. Something I haven't said yet because it isn't the kind of thing you lead with. My husband, Corey's father, the man who left with 2 suitcases and a note on the counter, did not simply vanish from our lives after that morning. He came back twice over the following decade, each time full of apologies and promises, each time asking to be let back in. And each time I said no, not out of bitterness, but because I had learned by then what it looked like when someone wanted access to a life without wanting to actually rebuild the trust that access requires. I recognized something of that same shape in Harlow's behavior. And I think that recognition is part of what let me move as calmly and clearly as I did during those weeks. I had been here before in a different configuration, with a different face across the table from me, and I had already learned decades earlier exactly what it costs a person to let someone keep taking without ever truly earning it back. The weeks between the paintbrush conversation with Corey and what eventually happened at dinner were quiet on the surface, but full of movement underneath, the way a river looks calm from the bank while the current beneath it is doing all the real work. Corey started slowly, standing up in small ways I hadn't seen from him before. When Harlow made a comment at dinner one evening about how she didn't understand why I still used cloth napkins instead of paper ones, calling it very old-fashioned, Corey said, quietly but clearly, "I like the cloth napkins. Mom's used them my whole life. It was such a small thing, napkins." But I watched Harlow's face flicker with surprise, the particular surprise of someone encountering resistance from a source that has, up until that point, offered none. Harlow, for her part, seemed to sense that something in the house had shifted, though she couldn't have known exactly what or why. She grew, if anything, more careful around me during that stretch, more performatively pleasant, complimenting my cooking again, asking after my day, offering to help with dishes in a way she'd never bothered to before. I understood this for exactly what it was. Not genuine warmth, but recalibration. A predator adjusting its approach when the terrain stops behaving the way it expected. I accepted her pleasantness politely, the same careful, measured politeness I'd have offered a stranger, because I had already decided that whatever came next between us was going to be built on facts laid plainly on the table, not on the performance of a relationship that had never actually existed the way she wanted Corey to believe it did. I want to tell you about Denise now, Harlow's mother, because she plays a larger role in this story than I initially understood, and because I think it's important when telling a story like this one, not to make Harlow into some kind of villain who sprang fully formed out of nowhere. People are shaped by the people who raise them, the same way Corey was shaped by jobs and library books and a mother who never let him see her cry. I met Denise properly for the first time at real length at a family dinner I hosted about 5 weeks after the wedding, the same dinner where everything I'd been quietly gathering finally came out into the open. But before that dinner, I did some careful, gentle asking around, mostly through Corey, mostly framed as harmless curiosity about my new extended family. And what I learned painted a picture that helped me understand Harlow a great deal better, even if it didn't excuse anything she'd done. Denise, it turned out, had been through something strikingly similar herself, decades earlier with her own mother-in-law, a woman by all accounts far crueler and far less patient than I had ever been with Harlow. Denise had spent years locked out of decisions about a family home, had watched her own mother-in-law control finances and property with an iron grip well into old age, and had, by the time Harlow was a teenager, developed a deep, almost reflexive suspicion of any older woman holding property that her own children might one day need. I think Denise looked at me and did not see Margaret Hale, a widow who'd raised her son on library books and trumpet lessons. I think she saw a ghost of her own mother-in-law. And I think she'd spent years quietly coaching her daughter, without perhaps even fully realizing she was doing it, to get ahead of a threat that had, in my case, never actually existed. This does not excuse the slap. It does not excuse the accusation over a ring that was never missing. But I share it because understanding where someone's fear comes from is often the first real step toward untangling it. And I did not want to walk into that dinner 5 weeks later carrying only anger. I wanted to walk in carrying the whole picture. I planned that dinner carefully, the way I used to plan the household budget when money was tight and every dollar had to do exactly what I needed it to do. I invited Corey and Harlow, of course. I invited my sister Patricia, who I trusted completely and who had been my steadiest source of clear thinking through the whole ordeal. I invited Denise as well, and Harlow's father, a quiet, kind man named Walter, who I'd met only briefly at the wedding, but who had struck me as someone with a good deal more sense than he was usually given room to express. I told everyone it was simply a family dinner, a chance to get to know each other better now that the wedding rush had settled. And in a certain sense, that was true. I just didn't mention that I intended, before the evening ended, to lay every card I'd been holding face up on the table. I spent the morning of that dinner cooking the way I used to cook for holidays when Corey was small, and money allowed for a little extra, a roast, fresh bread, a pie I hadn't made in years because it had always been Corey's favorite as a boy, and I wanted, whatever happened that evening, for my son to know that nothing about this was coming from a place of coldness. I set the table with the cloth napkins Harlow had criticized weeks earlier, and I laid a folder, slim and unremarkable, on the side table in the living room, close enough to reach when I needed it, far enough not to draw attention before I was ready. Everyone arrived within 20 minutes of each other that evening, the way family dinners tend to unfold, a little staggered, a little chaotic, coats piled on the bench by the door, the smell of roast filling the whole downstairs. Denise arrived in a sharp blazer, ear kissing my cheek in a way that felt more like a formality than affection. And Walter followed a step behind her, offering me a warm, genuine handshake and a bottle of wine he'd picked out himself, apologizing that he didn't know much about wine, but that the man at the store had assured him it paired well with roast beef. I liked Walter immediately, the way you sometimes like people on instinct before you've had any real reason to. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Patricia, bless her, kept the early conversation light, asking Denise about her garden, asking Walter about his fishing trips. And I watched Corey relax slightly as the meal went on, the tension in his shoulders easing the way it used to when he was small and a thunderstorm had finally passed. Overnight, Harlow was warm and talkative, telling a story about a work presentation that had gone well that week, and for a stretch of maybe 40 minutes, sitting around my table with the good china out and the cloth napkins in everyone's laps, it almost felt like an ordinary happy family dinner, the kind I used to dream about having again after so many years of it being just Corey and me at that same table. It was Denise, actually, who opened the door I'd been waiting for, though she had no idea she was doing it. Somewhere over dessert, with the pie half eaten and coffee cups steaming on the table, she turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "So, Margaret, have you and Corey talked at all about long-term plans for this house? It's such a big place for just one person. I imagine it must get lonely." I felt Corey go still beside me. I felt Harlow's fork pause halfway to her mouth. I set my own coffee cup down very carefully in its saucer, the small clink of it the only sound in the room for a moment. And I said, "Actually, Denise, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been meaning to talk to everyone about exactly that." I reached over to the side table and picked up the folder I'd left there earlier that evening. I opened it slowly, not for drama, though I'll admit there was a part of me that understood the weight of the moment. But because my hands, even steady as they were, needed a task to occupy them while I said what I'd been preparing to say for weeks. 3 weeks ago, I began. On the third day after the wedding, Harlow accused me of stealing her ring in this kitchen at breakfast. Denise's mouth opened slightly, watched Corey's hand grip the edge of the table. Harlow herself had gone very white, very still, her eyes fixed on me with an expression somewhere between panic and disbelief. I would say this out loud, here, now, in front of her parents. "I found the ring 2 weeks later," I continued, my voice even, unhurried, behind the leg of the guest bed, exactly where it had likely fallen during the move-in, because I wanted to understand what had actually happened before I said anything to anyone. "Mom, please," Corey started, but I raised my hand gently, not unkindly, and he stopped. "I'm not finished," I told him, and then I looked at Harlow directly. A few days after I found the ring, I overheard a phone call. I wasn't looking for it. I was carrying towels to the linen closet. "But I heard you tell your mother that the slap," and I'm quoting you as closely as I can, "kind of worked, and that I'd been walking on eggshells around you ever since. I heard you say you wanted to figure out how to get yourself, and Corey added to the deed of this house, and that you thought if I felt like I owed you something, it would be easier to have that conversation." The silence that followed was the kind of silence I imagine happens right before a dam breaks, a held, straining quiet that everyone in the room could feel pressing against the walls. Denise's face had gone through several expressions in the space of a few seconds. Shock, then something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition, and finally, to her credit, something that looked like genuine, dawning horror. Walter had set down his coffee cup entirely and was staring at his daughter with an expression I can only describe as heartbreak. "Harlow," Walter said quietly, "is that true?" Harlow's eyes had filled with tears, though I want to be honest with you and say that in that moment I could not tell whether they were tears of shame or tears of being caught. And I think if I'm honest, Harlow herself might not have known the difference either. "It's not what it sounds like," she said, her voice cracking. I was upset. I was venting to my mom. People say things they don't mean when they're venting. You said it worked, I told her, gently but firmly. Not that you regretted it, that it worked. There's a difference, Harlow, and I think you know there's a difference. Corey had gone very quiet beside me, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different than I'd heard it in weeks, steadier, lower, the voice I remembered from before the wedding, before the silence had crept in and taken up residence in him. You told me it was stress, he said, turning to face his wife fully. You told me you overreacted because of the ring and the move and your mom, calling about the cards. You never once told me you did it on purpose. You let me believe my own mother was making something small into something big, when the whole time you knew exactly what you'd done and why. Corey, Harlow said, reaching for his hand, but he didn't take it. I need you to answer the question, he said. Did you slap my mother on purpose to establish some kind of, I don't even know what to call it, some kind of control so that she'd feel like she had to give us something later? The room waited. I watched Harlow's face crumble slowly, the composed, pleasant mask she'd worn for 2 years, finally cracking under the weight of her own mother sitting beside her, her own father staring at her with an expression she'd clearly never wanted to see on his face, her husband asking her a direct question with no room left in it for deflection. I didn't think it would go this far, she finally said quietly, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her before. My mom always says that older women who've had control for a long time don't give it up easily. That you have to establish yourself early or you'll spend your whole marriage being pushed to the side. I've watched her deal with that her whole life. With your grandmother, she added, glancing at Denise, who flinched visibly. I thought if Margaret felt like she needed to smooth things over with us, it would make everything easier down the road. I didn't think about how it would actually feel to you, hearing that we did it on purpose. I told myself it was just being smart. I didn't let myself think about what it actually meant. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. Hearing my daughter-in-law finally admit, in front of her own parents, in front of my son, exactly what she'd done and why. But that isn't quite what I felt. What I felt sitting at that table with the pie half-eaten and the coffee gone cold was something closer to sadness. A deep, tired sadness for a young woman who had clearly been raised to see family as a kind of battlefield to be strategized rather than a place to be safe in. And a sadness for my own son, who had spent 3 weeks caught between the two most important women in his life because neither of us had told him the whole truth soon enough. I did not feel triumphant. I felt more than anything ready for it to finally be over. Denise was the next to speak, and I remember being surprised by what came out of her, because up until that point, I had privately assumed she would defend her daughter reflexively, the way I imagine I might have defended Corey if our positions had somehow been reversed. Instead, she set her napkin down on the table, folded her hands together, and said, in a voice much quieter than the one she'd used earlier that evening, "This is my fault as much as hers. I've spent years telling her stories about my mother-in-law, about feeling powerless in my own marriage for a long time because I never had a seat at the table when it came to anything that mattered. I never meant for her to take that and turn it into something she'd use against someone else before she even had a reason to. Margaret, I'm sorry. Truly, what she did to you was wrong. And I think some part of that wrongness started with me, even if I never told her to hit anyone." I appreciated Denise saying that more than I think she realized. It is a rare thing in my experience for a parent to sit in a room full of people and take responsibility for the ways their own fears shape their child's behavior. And I told her so, gently, because I did not want that moment of honesty to go unacknowledged. I told her that I understood fear like that I had raised my own son under the shadow of a man who left us with nothing but a note on a counter, and that fear left unexamined has a way of passing itself down through a family like an inheritance nobody actually wants, but everybody keeps anyway. Walter reached over and took his wife's hand at that point. And then he turned to Harlow and said something I think mattered more to her than anything. I could have said myself, I didn't raise you to think of family as something you have to outmaneuver, he told her. I raised you to believe that love doesn't need strategy behind it. I'm disappointed, Harlow, not because you made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm disappointed because you knew it was wrong the whole time and you did it anyway. And then you let your husband believe a version of events that protected you instead of telling him the truth. Harlow cried through most of what came next, not the composed, careful tears I imagine she might have used in other situations to smooth things over, but real, ragged crying, the kind that comes when a person finally sees themselves clearly and doesn't much like what they see. I want to be fair to her here because I think it's important. I do not believe Harlow is at her core a cruel person. I believe she is a young woman who was taught by people who loved her and were themselves shaped by their own old wounds that love and safety in a family are things you have to fight for and secure early, rather than things that are simply given, built slowly, over years of small kindnesses stacking on top of each other. That belief made her do an unkind thing to me, a genuinely unkind thing that I will not pretend didn't hurt both my face and something much deeper than my face. But understanding where a wound comes from doesn't mean you have to keep bleeding from it forever. And by the end of that dinner, I had already begun quietly to decide what I wanted to do with everything that had just been laid out on my table. I did not offer forgiveness that night. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important not to make this sound like a fairy tale where everything resolves itself in one tidy conversation over pie. What I offered that night was clarity, the same clarity Franklin Osei had given me weeks earlier when he told me the house had always been mine, and no amount of pressure could change that. I told Harlow calmly in front of her parents and my son that I understood now what had happened and why, and that I appreciated her honesty in finally naming it out loud instead of letting it sit, disguised as stress and overreaction. I told her that I was not interested in punishing her, but that I was also not interested in pretending the last 5 weeks hadn't happened, and that whatever relationship we built going forward would need to be built on the truth we'd just put on the table, not on the polite performance we'd been managing before it. Corey walked his mother-in-law and father-in-law to the door that night, and I heard him apologize to Denise and Walter for how tense the evening had gotten, though I noticed with a small private satisfaction that he did not apologize for the truth having come out. That, I think, was the moment I understood my son had finally found the spine my sister, Patricia, had told me weeks earlier that he'd left at the door. The weeks that followed the dinner were not easy ones, and I don't want to pretend they were. Harlow moved through the house differently after that night. Quieter, more careful, not in the performed way she'd been careful before, but in a way that looked, to my eye at least, like genuine reckoning. She apologized to me again, properly this time, about 4 days after the dinner, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where all of this had started. This apology was different from the first one. It was longer, messier, full of the kind of specific detail that tells you a person has actually sat with what they did instead of simply wanting the discomfort of the moment to end. She named the slap directly. She named the accusation about the ring directly. She told me she understood now that what she'd done wasn't really about a ring or about stress, but about a fear she'd been carrying long before she ever met me. A fear that had nothing to do with who I actually was and everything to do with old stories she'd absorbed without ever questioning them. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt her. And when she finished, I told her the truth, which was that I appreciated the apology, that I believed she meant it, but that trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself in a single conversation. no matter how honest that conversation is. I told her that I was willing to try, slowly, patiently, the same way I'd built almost everything worthwhile in my life, but that I needed her to understand this would take time. And that time was something I was only willing to spend on genuine effort, not performance. She agreed. And to her credit, over the following weeks, she followed through in ways that surprised me. She started asking me real questions, not the pointed, strategic ones about the house, but genuine questions about my life, about Corey's childhood, about my late husband, about the 31 years I'd spent as a bookkeeper at that hardware store. She sat with me one Sunday afternoon while I made the same recipe box I'd used since Corey was small, and she asked if I would teach her a few of the recipes he'd grown up loving. Not, I sensed, out of obligation, but out of something that felt like genuine curiosity about the family she'd married into. Small things, ordinary things. But ordinary things, stacked patiently on top of each other, are exactly how trust gets rebuilt, the same way it gets broken. I think this is the part of the story where I need to slow down and talk, honestly, about forgiveness. Because I know some of you listening are the kind of people who believe forgiveness means forgetting, means pretending something never happened, means opening your arms right back up the moment someone says sorry and expecting everything to feel exactly the way it did before. I don't believe that, and I never have. I think real forgiveness is something much slower and much sturdier than that. I think it's less like flipping a switch and more like rebuilding a fence after a storm has knocked half of it down. You don't just prop the old boards back up and call it done. You go through and check every post. You replace what's rotted. You make sure the whole thing can actually hold weight again before you trust it to keep anything in or anything out. That's the kind of forgiveness I decided to offer Harlow. The slow, sturdy, fence rebuilding kind. Not because I'm a saint, and I promise you I am not, but because I looked at my son's face during that dinner, watched him finally find his voice after weeks of silence, and understood that if I wanted a real relationship with him going forward, I needed to make room for the possibility that his wife could change, the same way I'd want someone to make room for the possibility that I could change if our position had ever been reversed. There was a moment about 6 weeks after the dinner that I think of as the true turning point in all of this. More than the dinner itself, more than the apology at the kitchen table. Harlow and Corey had moved out by then, into the renovated house 2 streets over, the one they'd originally planned to move into after just 6 or 8 weeks, and which had ended up taking closer to 3 months, once all the delays were accounted for. I helped them move that final weekend, carrying boxes the same way I'd carried boxes for Corey a dozen times before, back when it was just the 2 of us and a rented apartment and not much else. Near the end of the day, when most of the boxes were unpacked and the house was starting to look like an actual home instead of a construction site, Harlow found me in the kitchen, unwrapping dishes from newspaper, and she sat down at the small table they'd bought together and said, "Can I tell you something? And you don't have to say anything back, you can just listen." I told her, of course, and set the dish I was holding down on the counter. "My whole life," she said, "my mom taught me that the way you survive in a family that isn't originally yours is by getting ahead of everything before it gets ahead of you." She never said it exactly like that, but that's what it added up to, watching her. Get in early. Establish your place. Don't wait for someone to hand you security, because they might not, and then you'll have nothing. I think I walked into your house already braced for a fight nobody was actually starting. And I think somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if I didn't fight for something, I'd end up like her, on the outside of her own family for 20 years. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. I just wanted you to understand that it was never really about you, Margaret. It was about a fear I'd been carrying around long before I ever sat at your table. I told her, sitting in that half-unpacked kitchen with newspaper crumpled around my feet, that I understood fear like that better than she probably realized, that I'd spent decades of my own life bracing for a second abandonment that never actually came. That fear has a way of making us do things to people who never earned our suspicion in the first place. I told her that I forgave her, not because what she did was small, but because I believed, watching her these past 6 weeks, that she was actually doing the work of becoming someone different than the fear that had shaped her. I told her that forgiveness for me wasn't about deciding the slap hadn't hurt. It had hurt, and some part of it probably always would. The way an old injury aches sometimes when the weather changes, even long after it's healed. But I told her I was choosing deliberately to build something new with her instead of carrying that morning around with me for the rest of whatever years I had left. Because carrying it wouldn't punish her nearly as much as it would punish me. And I had already spent too many years of my life letting other people's failures cost me pieces of my own peace. Harlow cried again that day, quieter this time. And she got up from the table and hugged me. Really hugged me. Not the careful, performed hug from that first dinner 2 years earlier, when her cousins had commented on how close we seemed. I hugged her back. And I want to tell you honestly that it didn't erase the morning of the slap, didn't make my cheek forget the sting of it, didn't undo 3 weeks of walking through my own house, feeling like a stranger in it. But it was a real beginning, the first real beginning we'd had. And sometimes a real beginning is worth more than a false ending, pretending everything was fine all along. I want to tell you about Corey too, because his part in all of this deserves more room than I've given it so far. In the months after that dinner, my son changed in ways that went beyond the marriage entirely. He started calling me more, not out of guilt, I don't think, but out of something that looked more like genuine wanting. He started asking my opinion on things again, the way he used to when he was a teenager, trying to figure out the world, before he'd learned somewhere in his 20s that grown men aren't supposed to need their mother's advice anymore. He told me once on the phone late one evening that the hardest part of the whole ordeal wasn't watching his wife slap his mother. It was realizing in the days after that he'd become the kind of man who could watch it happen and say nothing, and that the realization scared him more than almost anything else had in his adult life. I don't want to be someone who goes quiet when it matters, he told me. I think I've been going quiet my whole life. Actually, ever since Dad left, like some part of me decided that if I just didn't make waves, nobody else would leave either. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I watched myself do it to you. I told my son that recognizing a pattern is the hardest part of breaking it, and that I was proud of him, not for being perfect, because none of us are, but for being willing to look honestly at the parts of himself that hadn't served him or the people he loved. I told him his father leaving had shaped both of us more than either of us had probably ever said out loud to each other, and that maybe it was time we talked about that more honestly too, instead of just carrying it around separately, each of us assuming the other had moved past it long ago. We did talk about it more than we ever had before over the months that followed. I told him things about his father I'd never told him, not out of secrecy, but because I hadn't wanted to burden a small boy with the full weight of an adult heartbreak. He told me things about his own memories of that time I hadn't known he still carried. Small moments. The sound of the door closing that morning. The way he used to check the driveway every day after school for months afterward. Half hoping, half dreading that his father's car would be there. We had, in a strange ways, needed this entire ordeal with Harlow to finally sit down and have the conversation we should have had years earlier. And I have come in the months since to see even the hardest parts of this story as having opened a door that badly needed opening. Patricia, my sister, came to visit about 2 months after that dinner. And I remember sitting with her on my back porch one evening, the two of us with cups of tea going lukewarm between our hands. And she asked me the question I think a lot of you listening might be wondering yourselves. She asked me whether I regretted not confronting Harlow the moment I found that ring behind the bed. whether some part of me wished I'd handled things faster, louder, with less patience, and more immediate consequence. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered her, because I think it deserves a real answer, not a quick one. I told Patricia that I understood the instinct behind the question, that there's a version of this story where I confront Harlow the moment I find the ring, where I demand an immediate apology, where the whole thing gets resolved or doesn't in the space of a single loud conversation instead of stretching out over 5 careful weeks. But I told her I didn't think that version would have actually gotten me what I wanted, which was never punishment for its own sake. What I wanted underneath everything was for my son to see clearly what was happening in his own marriage, for Harlow to actually understand the fear that was driving her instead of simply learning to hide it better, and for whatever came out the other side of this to be something real and sturdy instead of something patched together out of panic and guilt. Loud, immediate confrontations are good for winning a single moment. They are not always good for building something that lasts. And I had already decided, standing in that hallway with the towels in my arms, that I wanted more than a single moment of being right. I wanted my family whole, honest, and actually capable of trusting each other again. Patricia nodded slowly at that, the way she does when she's turning something over in her mind before responding. And then she told me something that I've thought about often since. She said, "You've always done this, even when we were girls. Everybody else in the family would blow up over something and it would be over in a day. Forgotten, unresolved. Waiting to blow up again over something else 6 months later. You were always the one who sat with things, who figured out what they actually meant before you decided what to do about them. I used to think it made you slow. I don't think that anymore. I think it's the reason your family actually gets to heal instead of just moving on." I don't know that I fully agree with my sister's assessment of myself, because I don't think I've ever felt as calm on the inside as I probably appeared on the outside during those 5 weeks. There were nights I lay awake replaying that slap in my mind, feeling the sting of it fresh all over again, feeling something close to rage at a woman half my age who had struck me in a house I'd spent decades making into a home. There were mornings I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee, looking out at the same tree line I've watched the sun rise over for 34 years, wondering whether I was being foolish, whether patience was actually wisdom, or whether it was just another word for letting myself be walked over one more time in a life that had already asked me to absorb more than my fair share of other people's failures. I want you to know that the calm you might be hearing in how I've told you this story was not calm I felt the whole way through it. It was calm I chose deliberately, morning after morning, because I decided a long time ago, somewhere around the time my late husband left with 2 suitcases and a note, that I would rather be the kind of woman who thinks clearly under pressure than the kind of woman who simply reacts to it. The first holiday season after all of this happened was Thanksgiving, hosted at my house the way it always has been, going back to when Corey was small enough to need a booster seat at this same table. I invited Harlow's parents that year too, Denise and Walter, and I want to tell you that the version of Denise who showed up to that Thanksgiving was almost unrecognizable from the woman who'd sat across from me 5 months earlier with that tight, careful smile that didn't reach her eyes. She arrived early, actually before anyone else, carrying a dish she'd made herself, a sweet potato casserole with a recipe she told me had been in her family for 3 generations, and she asked a little nervously whether it would be all right if she helped me in the kitchen, instead of sitting in the living room making small talk with people she barely knew. We spent almost 2 hours in that kitchen together that afternoon, the 2 of us working side by side the way women and families are supposed to, and somewhere between basting the turkey and mashing the potatoes, Denise told me something I hadn't expected. She told me she'd been seeing a counselor since that dinner, mostly, she said, to work through some of what had come up that night about her own mother-in-law, about the fear she'd apparently passed down to Harlow without ever meaning to. I keep thinking about what you said, she told me, wiping her hands on a dish towel, about fear being an inheritance nobody actually wants, but everybody keeps anyway. I think I've been carrying my mother-in-law around in my chest for 20 years, and I think I handed her straight to my daughter without ever asking whether that's actually what I wanted to give her. I told Denise that recognizing an inheritance like that is the hardest part, and that I admired her for doing the work to set it down instead of simply carrying it forward the way it had been carried to her. We worked in comfortable silence after that for a while. The kind of silence that happens between women who have decided to actually trust each other instead of the polite, performed silence that had sat between Harlow and me in those first few weeks. When Corey and Harlow arrived a little later that afternoon, Harlow found her mother and me laughing together in the kitchen over something small, a joke about how neither of us could ever get the gravy quite right on the first try. And I watched her face go soft and a little disbelieving, the way a person's face goes soft when they're witnessing something they genuinely started to think might never be possible. That Thanksgiving dinner was, I think, the first time since the wedding that our whole extended family sat around a table together without anyone quietly bracing themselves for something to go wrong. Corey said grace before we ate, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. And in it, he thanked everyone at the table for, in his words, being willing to tell the truth even when it was hard, and for loving each other enough to stick around and rebuild instead of walking away. I looked around that table while he spoke, at Harlow with her head bowed and her hand resting on Corey's arm, at Denise sitting beside Walter with an expression on her face I hadn't seen from her before, something like relief, something like hope, and at my sister Patricia catching my eye from across the table with a small, knowing smile. I felt for the first time in months something settle fully in my chest, the way a house settles after a long storm has finally passed and you realize, walking through each room, that everything important is still standing. Christmas came a month after that, and by then, something had shifted so thoroughly in our family that I almost couldn't remember some days. The particular ache of that breakfast. A table in early spring. Almost. I'm going to be honest with you, because I promised you honesty from the start of this story. And honesty means telling you that healing isn't a straight line, no matter how much progress gets made. There were still moments, small ones, scattered through those months, where something would catch me off guard. A certain tone in Harlow's voice that reminded me too much of that morning. A certain look on Corey's face that reminded me of his silence. And in those moments, the old ache would rise up in me fresh, sharp, uninvited. I let myself feel it when it came. I did not pretend it away or scold myself for still feeling it months later. I've learned over 71 years that grief and hurt do not follow a schedule, and that pretending they do only makes them linger longer, hiding underneath a performance of being fully fine. Harlow gave me a gift that Christmas that I still think about often. It wasn't expensive, nothing like the dress she'd worn to that first dinner 2 years earlier. It was a small framed photograph she'd had printed, a picture taken at the wedding of me dancing with Corey during the father-daughter dance that had, in the absence of his own father, become a mother-son dance instead. The two of us laughing at something I no longer remember. My hand on his shoulder, his hand in mine, both of us caught mid-spin under those string lights hung between the old oak trees. Underneath the photograph, in the wide white mat around it, Harlow had written a single line in careful handwriting. It said, "Thank you for raising the man I get to love, and for teaching me the hard way what it actually means to be part of a family instead of just surviving one." I cried when I opened that gift, right there in my living room with everyone watching. And I am not a woman who cries easily in front of a room full of people. I hugged Harlow for a long time that Christmas morning, longer than either of us probably expected. And when we finally let go, I told her that I was proud of who she was becoming and that I meant it with my whole chest, not as a polite thing you say to a daughter-in-law at Christmas, but as a true thing I had watched unfold with my own eyes over the previous 8 months. I want to take a moment here before I bring this story to its close to talk directly to some of you listening, because I have a feeling this story might be reaching a few women who are living through a version of what I lived through right now, tonight, in their own kitchens with their own daughters-in-law or sons-in-law, feeling like the ground under their own family is shifting in a direction they don't fully understand yet. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to be patient without being weak. Patience is not the same thing as tolerance for cruelty, and clarity is not the same thing as coldness. You are allowed to gather your facts quietly before you decide what to do with them. You are allowed to protect what's legally yours, your home, your finances, your future, without a single ounce of guilt. Because protecting yourself is not an act of aggression. It is simply wisdom. The same wisdom that's kept women and families like mine standing upright for generations, even when the grounds kept shifting beneath us. And you are allowed, when the moment finally comes, to choose forgiveness over resentment. Not because you owe anyone that forgiveness, but because carrying resentment for the rest of your life is a heavier weight than most of us actually want to keep lifting every single morning. I also want to say something to the sons and daughters listening to this, because I think Corey's part in this story matters just as much as mine or Harlow's. If you find yourself caught between your parent and your partner, staying silent because speaking up feels like choosing a side, I want you to understand what my son eventually understood, standing in that yard with a paintbrush in his hand. Silence is a side. It is always a side. It just happens to be the side that costs you the least in the short term and the most in the long run. Because the people who love you, both of them, are watching to see whether you'll tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And every time you choose the quiet, easy path instead, you teach both of them a little less to trust you with the truth going forward. My son learned this the hard way, in a kitchen over eggs and toast, and I watched it cost him something real before he found his way back to who he actually wanted to be. I told my friend Yvonne, the realtor, about everything eventually, over coffee one Tuesday morning, the way we always do, and she listened the whole way through without interrupting, the same way Franklin Ose had listened months earlier in his office. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and said something that surprised me. She said, "Margaret, you know you're not the only one of us this has happened to, right? Half the women in our little Tuesday coffee group have some version of this story tucked away somewhere." Ruth's daughter-in-law spent 2 years trying to convince her to sign her house over into a family trust that conveniently gave her son and his wife control over it. Carol's son-in-law once told her to her face that she was being selfish for not moving into assisted living sooner so they could rent out her house for extra income. We don't talk about it much because it feels embarrassing somehow. Like admitting it means admitting we let our guard down. But you didn't let your guard down, Margaret. You just loved your son enough to give his marriage every possible chance before you protected yourself. And there's nothing shameful about that. I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, about how many women my age are quietly sitting on stories just like mine, absorbing small cruelties and strange requests, and pointed comments about their homes and their futures, telling themselves it's just family being family, just the natural friction of blending two lives together, when really it's something with a shape and a pattern that deserves to be named out loud, instead of quietly endured. I started after that conversation with Yvonne, being a little more open about what had happened, not out of a need for sympathy, but because I began to understand that my silence about it, even after everything had been resolved within my own family, was only helping keep the pattern invisible to other women who might be living through the early stages of the exact same thing right now, without yet having the words to name what they were feeling. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being an older woman living alone, one that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough. And I want to be honest with you about it here because I think it's part of why this whole situation was able to take root in the first place. When my husband left all those years ago and later, as the decades passed and Corey grew up and moved into his own life, I built a kind of quiet, steady independence for myself that I was genuinely proud of. I learned to fix my own leaking faucets. I learned to manage my own finances, my own home repairs, my own long, quiet evenings that used to have a second person's footsteps somewhere else in the house, and now simply an independence, real as it was, didn't erase the part of me that still wanted deeply to belong to something larger than myself, to matter to a family in an ongoing, active way rather than simply as a name on a holiday card list. I think that wanting is exactly what made me so willing for so long to absorb Harlow's coldness without pushing back. I wasn't just protecting my son's marriage. I was protecting my own fragile hope that I still had a real, ongoing place inside my own family. And some part of me was terrified that pushing back too hard might cost me that place entirely. I share this not because I think it excuses how long I waited to act, but because I think a lot of people my age carry this exact fear quietly. And it makes us vulnerable in ways that younger people, still surrounded by the busyness of building their own families, sometimes forget to consider. If you have an older parent or grandparent in your life, I want to gently ask you, on behalf of every woman like me sitting somewhere with a story just like mine folded up quietly in her chest, to check in with them a little more than you think you need to. Ask them how they're really doing when a new person joins the family. Watch for the things they don't quite say out loud. We are often more willing to absorb quiet unkindness than we are to risk losing our place at the table entirely. And that willingness can be exploited by people who understand it better than we'd like to admit. Spring came around again, a full year after the wedding, and Corey called me on a Sunday afternoon with a tremble in his voice that I recognized immediately. The same tremble he'd had calling me about Harlow for the first time 2 years earlier. Harlow was pregnant. They wanted me to be the first person outside the two of them to know, before even Denise and Walter. And I understood, hearing that, exactly how far we'd all traveled since that breakfast table the year before. I cried on the phone with my son that afternoon. Happy tears this time, uncomplicated ones. And when I hung up, I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where all of this had started, and I looked at the table where Harlow had once accused me of theft and struck me across the face. And I felt something close and settle inside me. A chapter finally closing the way chapters are supposed to close, not with everything forgotten, but with everything folded carefully into the larger, ongoing story of a family that had chosen, in the end, to keep building instead of breaking apart. Harlow asked me a few weeks later whether I would help decorate the nursery, the same way I'd once made up the guest room for her all those months earlier. And I said yes without a moment of hesitation. And I want you to understand what a full circle that felt like. Standing in a half-painted nursery with my daughter-in-law, picking out curtains together, discussing which of Corey's old childhood things might be worth pulling out of my attic for their baby. A rocking chair I'd nursed him in myself, a small wooden train set his father had, ironically, actually managed to build before he left. Harlow held that little wooden train in her hands that afternoon, turning it over carefully, and she looked up at me and said, "I want our baby to grow up the way Corey did, loved by someone who never gave up on him, even when it would have been easier to." I told her that love, that isn't really about never giving up. It's about deciding over and over again, every single day, that the person in front of you is worth the effort of trying one more time, even on the days it would be far easier not to. The baby, a girl, was born in early autumn, and they named her Eleanor after my own mother, a woman Harlow had never met but had asked me enough questions about over the preceding months to decide the name belonged in the next generation of this family. I sat in that hospital room hours after the birth, holding my granddaughter for the first time, feeling the particular overwhelming weight of a new life settling into my arms. And I thought about that breakfast table again. The way you sometimes think about a storm long after the sky has cleared, not with fear anymore, but with a kind of quiet gratitude for having weathered it instead, of letting it wash the whole house away. Arlo watched me hold her daughter that afternoon, exhausted and glowing the way new mothers are, and she said, "I keep thinking about how close I came to ruining this before it even started. If you'd reacted differently that morning, if you'd shut me out completely, or if Corey had just let things stay quiet forever, none of this would exist the way it does now. She wouldn't have a grandmother who taught her mother how to actually be part of a family instead of just defending herself inside one." I told her that we'd both made choices that mattered in those early weeks, not just me, and that the real credit belonged to both of us for choosing again and again to keep showing up honestly instead of letting pride or fear or old inherited stories decide the ending for us. I think if I'm honest, the version of myself sitting in that hospital room, a full year and a half removed from that awful morning, would have seemed almost unrecognizable to the version of myself standing at my kitchen window with my hand pressed against my stinging cheek, wondering how I'd let things get so far without saying something sooner. I don't regret the patience I showed in those 5 weeks between the slap and the dinner where everything finally came out. I've told you already why I don't regret it, and I meant every word of that reasoning. But I also don't want to pretend that patience is always the right answer for every woman in every version of this story. Some situations call for immediate, loud, uncompromising boundaries. And I want to be clear that if what happened to me had been part of an ongoing pattern of physical harm rather than a single, deliberate incident born out of a young woman's inherited fear, my response would have looked very different, and it should have. I chose patience because I believed, based on everything I knew about the people involved, that there was real room for growth and honesty underneath what had happened. That belief turned out to be correct, but I want to be honest that it was a calculated risk, not a guarantee. And every woman living through something similar has to weigh her own situation carefully with her own safety as the very first consideration before deciding which path is right for her. Eleanor is nearly 9 months old now as I sit here telling you this story. She has her father's eyes and, according to Denise, her great-grandmother's stubborn chin. Though I suspect every family says something like that about every new baby regardless of how much it's actually true. She spends most Sundays at my house, the same house where all of this began, and Harlow and I have fallen into a rhythm I could not have imagined possible 18 months ago. Cooking together in that same kitchen, the cloth napkins still on the table, the coffee maker with the French press setting still, sitting beside my old drip machine because Harlow told me a few months back that she'd actually grown to like my coffee better anyway. Once she stopped drinking it out of obligation and started drinking it because she genuinely wanted to sit across from me in the mornings. I think often about the folder I kept during those 5 weeks, the dates and quotes and careful documentation I gathered like a woman building a case file against her own family. I still have it tucked in a drawer in my study, and I've thought more than once about throwing it away now that everything has settled into something so much gentler than what it once was. I haven't thrown it away, though, and I don't think I will. Not because I don't trust the peace we've built, but because I think it's important, for me at least, to keep a record of exactly how far we all traveled to get here. It reminds me that healing isn't something that simply happens to a family on its own. It's something you build deliberately, patiently, sometimes with a folder of hard evidence sitting on a side table waiting for the right moment, sometimes with nothing more than a willingness to keep showing up. Honestly, even when honesty costs you something in the short term. I want to leave you with one last thing before I let you go tonight. Something I told Harlow the day she brought Eleanor to visit for the first time, sitting in my living room with a newborn asleep between us. I told her that family isn't a thing you inherit by accident, the way a fear or an old wound gets passed down without anyone quite meaning to hand it over. Family, real family, the kind that actually holds you up instead of quietly waiting to see what it can take from you, is something you build on purpose. One honest conversation at a time. One apology that actually names what happened, instead of smoothing it into something vaguer. One choice made again and again. To trust the people in front of you a little more than the fear telling you not to. I built that kind of family once already, alone. Out of 2 jobs and library books with torn covers, I am grateful, more than I think I can properly say, that I got the chance to build it again. This time with a daughter-in-law who chose, in the end, to become someone worth building it with. I want to circle back before I close this out to something I mentioned near the beginning about my late husband and the 2 times he came back over the years asking to be let back into our lives. I never told Corey the full details of those visits when he was younger because I didn't think a boy needed the weight of his father's failed attempts at reconciliation sitting on his shoulders while he was still trying to grow up steady. But I told him this past year, sitting on the back porch one evening not long after Eleanor was born, and I think it mattered to him more than I expected. The first time his father came back, Corey was around 9. And I remember standing in the doorway of our old apartment listening to a man I had loved with my whole young heart explain, calmly, reasonably, that he'd made a mistake, that he'd been young and overwhelmed and scared of fatherhood in a way he hadn't known how to name at the time, and that he wanted a second chance to be the man he should have been from the start. I wanted more than almost anything in my life up to that point to believe him. But I asked him one question before I let myself believe anything. And it's the same question, I realize now, that has guided nearly every difficult decision I've made since. I asked him what specifically had changed. Not what he felt differently, not what he wanted differently, but what concretely had actually changed about the person standing in front of me versus the person who packed 2 suitcases and left a note on a counter 4 years earlier. He didn't have an answer. He had feelings, real ones, I believe, but no evidence of change, nothing concrete to point to beyond his own stated regret. I told him I was glad he regretted what he'd done, and I closed the door. The second time, 6 years later, he came back with more of an answer. He'd been sober for 2 years by then. He told me he had completed a program, had a steady job he'd held for over a year, had, by his own account, done real work to understand why he'd left in the first place. I let him see Corey a handful of times after that, carefully, slowly, watching closely for any sign that the change he claimed to have made wasn't as real as he said it was. It held for about 8 months before he disappeared again, this time without even a note. And Corey, 15 years old by then, and old enough to feel the full weight of a second abandonment, spent a long time afterward convinced that something about himself had caused it, the way children often do, no matter how many times you tell them otherwise. I bring this up now because I think the question I asked that first time, standing in the doorway of our old apartment, is the same question that guided how I handled everything with Harlow all those months later. What specifically has changed? Not just what someone feels sorry about, not just what they say they want to be different, but what concrete, sustained, observable change has actually taken place. Harlow's apology at my kitchen table 4 days after that, dinner meant something to me. But it wasn't the apology itself that eventually earned my trust back. It was the months of small, consistent actions that followed it, the real questions about my life, the recipes learned side by side, the way she started standing up for me in small moments instead of only performing warmth when it was convenient. Words are easy. Even honest, well-meant words are easy in the moment they're spoken. Sustained change is the only thing that actually tells you whether those words were the beginning of something real or simply the end of an uncomfortable conversation. Corey cried a little when I told him all of this on the porch that evening. Not out of sadness exactly, but out of something that looked like relief. Like a puzzle piece he'd been carrying around his whole life had finally clicked into a place that made sense of it. He told me he'd always sensed there was more to the story of his father than I'd let him know as a boy, and that hearing the full shape of it now, as a grown man with a daughter of his own, helped him understand something about his own instinct to go quiet during conflict. That maybe some part of him had learned, watching me stand in that doorway years ago, that the price of asking hard questions is sometimes losing the person you're asking them of, and that he'd spent years since then avoiding hard questions with the people he loved most because some part of him was still that 9-year-old boy standing behind me in the hallway, terrified of watching another door close. I told my son that understanding where a pattern comes from is only useful if you actually use that understanding to change the pattern going forward. The same way I told Denise months earlier at that first dinner. Insight without action is just a more articulate way of staying stuck. He nodded at that, and I think watching him with Eleanor over the months since, watching the way he speaks up now in small moments, corrects small unfairnesses before they have room to grow into large ones, that he's actually taken that lesson to heart in a way that will serve his own daughter far better than his own childhood served him. There's a question I get asked sometimes by the few friends I eventually told this whole story to in real time, and I imagine some of you listening tonight might be wondering the same thing. They ask whether I ever worry that Harlow's change is temporary, whether some part of me is still waiting quietly for the old coldness to resurface once enough time has passed and the memory of that dinner has faded into something easier to set aside. I understand why people ask that. Trust that has been broken once does tend to leave a permanent kind of watchfulness behind it. A small, quiet part of you that never fully stops checking the weather even on the sunniest days. I won't pretend that watchfulness isn't still there in me, somewhere folded into the corner of an otherwise peaceful life. But I've come to believe that watchfulness and trust aren't actually opposites the way I once assumed they were. You can hold both at once. You can love someone fully, build a real life alongside them, let your granddaughter fall asleep in their arms on a Sunday afternoon, and still keep a small, sensible part of yourself paying attention, the same way you'd keep an umbrella by the door even during a long stretch of good weather. Not because you expect rain, but because you've learned the hard way that weather has a way of changing when you least expect it. I think about the folder in my study drawer sometimes in exactly these terms. It isn't a weapon anymore. It isn't something I intend to ever bring out again unless circumstances gave me genuine reason to. It's simply my umbrella, my quiet acknowledgement that I lived through something real and I'm allowed to carry the memory of it forward as wisdom rather than as either weapon or wound. I think that's the healthiest place I've found to let this whole story settle inside me. Not as a grudge I'm still nursing, and not as something I've pretended never happened, but as a chapter of my life that taught me things about my son, my daughter-in-law, and myself that I don't think I could have learned any other way. I want to say one more thing about Denise before I close this out completely, because her arc in this story matters to me almost as much as Harlow's does. She and I have become, unexpectedly, genuinely good friends over the past year. The two grandmothers of the same small girl, meeting for coffee some Tuesdays now alongside Yvonne and Ruth and Carol, the whole little group of us, swapping stories about our families with a kind of honesty I don't think any of us had access to before all of this happened. Denise told me a few months back that she'd finally had the conversation with her own aging mother-in-law that she'd avoided for over 20 years, the woman whose control and coldness had originally taught Denise to see family as something to be strategized rather than trusted. She told me it didn't resolve into some tidy, movie-perfect reconciliation, that her mother-in-law was by all accounts, still a difficult, guarded woman who wasn't interested in fully examining the ways she'd shaped 2 generations of fear in her own family. But Denise told me that having the conversation anyway, even without a perfect resolution on the other end of it, had done something important for her, had let her finally set that particular weight down instead of continuing to carry it forward into how she raised her own daughter, and eventually how her daughter might have raised Eleanor without any of us ever understanding why. I think this is, in many ways, the real heart of everything I've told you tonight. Families carry things forward, generation after generation. Not always the things we choose if we were building a family from scratch with full awareness of every choice, but the accumulated weight of every fear, every wound, every unresolved conflict our own parents and grandparents never quite finished working through in their own lifetimes. Some of what got handed down to me, I've carried forward without ever fully examining it either. And I'm certain there are pieces of my own fear, my own old wounds from a husband who left with 2 suitcases and a note, that I've passed to Corey in ways I haven't fully reckoned with yet. The same way Denise passed her fear to Harlow without meaning to. I don't say this to excuse what happened at that breakfast table. I say it because I think the only way any of us actually break these patterns, instead of simply handing them down to the next generation, dressed in slightly different clothes, is by being willing to name them honestly, the way we finally did around my dinner table that evening, and by choosing deliberately, again and again, to build something different for the people who come after us. Eleanor will grow up someday and hear some version of this story. I suspect whether from her mother, or from Corey, or from me directly if I'm still here to tell it to her myself. I hope when she hears it, she understands it not as a story about a grandmother who got slapped and eventually forgave the woman who did it, though that's certainly part of what happened. I hope she understands it as a story about a family that chose, at a critical moment, to tell the truth to each other instead of letting comfortable silence protect the people who least deserved protecting. I hope she understands that love without honesty isn't actually love. It's just a kind of careful performance that eventually collapses under its own weight, and that real love, the kind worth building a whole life around, requires everyone at the table to be willing, eventually to say the hard thing out loud, even when saying it costs something in the moment. I sat down tonight to tell you about the morning my daughter-in-law slapped me at breakfast on the 3rd day of her marriage to my son. And I've ended up telling you I realize about almost everything that actually matters to me. About the husband who left, about the son I raised alone, about the fear that gets passed down through families like an inheritance nobody asked for, and about the slow, deliberate, sometimes painful work of choosing to build something honest instead of something merely comfortable. I don't think that's an accident. I think the small stories and the large ones are always more tangled together than we like to admit, and that you can't really understand a single breakfast morning without understanding everything that led 2 people to that table in the first place. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to thank you genuinely for sitting through an old woman's whole winding story instead of just wanting the short version with the satisfying ending. Life doesn't usually hand us the short version. It hands us the long, complicated, generational kind. And I think there's something worth honoring in taking the time to actually sit with all of it. The same way I finally learned to sit with my own family's whole complicated shape instead of only the parts that were easy to look at. I think, if I'm being fully honest with you, that the version of this story that would have been easiest to tell is the version where I simply painted Harlow as a villain from the first sentence to the last, where the slap was the beginning and the middle and the end of who she was, where I never had to sit with the discomfort of understanding her, only the satisfaction of being wronged and eventually vindicated. That version would have been simpler. It might have even felt more satisfying to some of you listening, The kind of story where the ending arrives clean, where the person who did wrong stays fully, permanently wrong, and the person who is wronged gets to stay fully, permanently right, without either of them having to do the harder work of actually looking at each other as whole, complicated people. I didn't tell you that version because it wouldn't have been true. And because I think stories like that, tidy as they are, don't actually teach us anything useful about how real families survive their hardest moments. What I've learned watching this whole thing unfold from that first cold dinner 2 years before the wedding, all the way to a 9-month-old girl named Eleanor falling asleep in my arms on quiet Sunday afternoons, is that most family wounds aren't caused by monsters. They're caused by ordinary, frightened people carrying ordinary, inherited fears, making choices in moments of pressure that they wouldn't necessarily make if they had the full clarity of hindsight available to them in the moment itself. That doesn't mean those choices don't cause real harm. They do. My cheek stung for the better part of a day after that slap. And something deeper than my cheek stung for a good deal longer than that. But understanding the fear behind a harmful choice is what actually gives you the option to build something different afterward. Instead of simply cutting the person out of your life and calling that resolution, when really it's just a different kind of unresolved ending, one where the pattern never actually gets examined, just relocated to whatever relationship comes next. I don't say any of this to suggest that everyone who hurts you deserves a second chance, or a third, or a fourth. I gave my own husband exactly 2 chances, decades apart. And when the pattern held instead of breaking, I closed that door permanently, and I have never once regretted closing it. The difference, I think, is in whether the person in front of you is actually willing to look honestly at what they did and why, or whether they're only interested in being forgiven quickly, so the discomfort can end without any real change required of them. Harlow was willing to look. My husband, both times he came back, wanted the forgiveness without doing the sustained work, the forgiveness, would have needed to actually mean something. I paid close attention to that difference both times because I think it's the single most important thing to watch for when you're deciding whether to open your heart back up to someone who's hurt you. I think about my mother sometimes too in all of this. The woman Eleanor is named after, a woman who raised 5 children through genuine hardship and who used to tell me when I was young and impatient and wanted every conflict resolved immediately that some things in life need to be given room to breathe before you can see their true shape clearly. I didn't understand what she meant for most of my life. I understand it now sitting here telling you this story in a way I don't think I could have understood it at 20 or 30 or even 50. Some conflicts, given room to breathe, reveal themselves to be exactly as bad as they first appeared, and you act accordingly, decisively, without hesitation. But some conflicts, given that same room to breathe, reveal a shape underneath them that you couldn't have seen clearly in the heat of the first moment. And it's only by giving that room that you get the chance to respond to what's actually there, instead of only to what your fear and your hurt initially told you was there. I want to close with something Corey said to me recently. Sitting in my kitchen on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, Eleanor asleep in her carrier on the table between us, Harlow upstairs finishing a work call before she came down to join us for lunch. He looked around my kitchen, the same kitchen where all of this began, the same table, the same cloth napkins, the same coffee maker with the French press, still sitting next to my old drip machine, and he said, "I used to think being a good husband meant keeping the peace no matter what it cost. I think I understand now that being a good husband and a good son means being willing to break the peace sometimes on purpose, when the peace itself is the thing that's actually hurting someone." I told my son that was one of the wisest things I'd ever heard him say. and that I wished someone had told me the same thing 40 years earlier. Though I suspect some lessons only ever really land once. You've lived through the version of the story where you learn them the hard way. I don't know what your own family's version of this story looks like. Whether you're the grandmother sitting quietly with a hurt you haven't named yet, or the daughter-in-law carrying a fear you inherited without ever choosing it, or the son or daughter caught in the exhausting middle, trying to keep two people you love from colliding with each other. Wherever you are in your own version of this, I hope something in mine has been useful to you tonight, not as a tidy lesson wrapped up with a bow, but as one old woman's honest, complicated, still unfolding account of what it actually took to turn a slap at a breakfast table into the foundation, eventually of something sturdier and more honest than what had existed in this family before it happened. I am 71 years old, and I have learned over every one of those years that the families worth keeping are never the ones that never break. They're the ones willing to sit in the wreckage together long enough to figure out how to rebuild something true out of it. That is what happened in my kitchen, in my dining room, on my back porch, over the course of a long, hard, honest year and a half. And that, more than the slap itself, more than the ring that was never really missing, more than the silence my son eventually broke, is the story I actually wanted to tell you tonight. There's one more small thing I want to tell you before I let you go. Something that happened just last week, small enough that I almost didn't think to include it. And yet it's the thing that made me finally decide to sit down and record this whole story for you tonight. Harlow called me on a Tuesday evening, not for any particular reason, just to talk, the way she does more and more often now. And near the end of the call, she mentioned, almost offhand, that a coworker of hers had recently gotten engaged, and that the coworker had spent the better part of an hour that afternoon venting to Harlow about how anxious she was about meeting her fiancé's mother for the first time, worried about being liked, worried about fitting into a family that already had its own history and its own rhythms long before she arrived. Harlow told me she'd found herself, without really planning to, telling this coworker a version of our story. Not every detail, but enough of it, enough to explain that the families worth marrying into are the ones willing to have the hard conversations instead of only the easy, comfortable ones. And that if her coworker found herself in a family like that, patient and honest even when it's difficult, she should count herself lucky rather than anxious. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up the phone. I thought about how strange and quietly meaningful it is that a story which began with such pain, such genuine hurt, sitting alone in my kitchen with my hand pressed against my stinging cheek, had traveled far enough now to become something Harlow herself reaches for when she wants to reassure someone else that hard family moments don't have to be endings. That felt to me like the truest measure of how far we've actually come. Not that the hurt never happened, but that it's been transformed slowly and deliberately into something that helps rather than something that simply festers. I hope wherever you are tonight, listening to an old woman tell you the long, complicated, honest version of her family's hardest year, that you take from it whatever you actually need. Maybe you needed permission to be patient with someone who's hurt you, to gather your own facts calmly before you decide what to do with them. Maybe you needed permission to stop being patient, to recognize that some patterns given room to breathe only ever reveal themselves to be exactly as harmful as they first appeared, and deserve a firm, immediate boundary instead of 5 careful weeks of quiet observation. Maybe you simply needed to hear that an ordinary breakfast table in an ordinary kitchen, in an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, can hold the whole shape of a family's healing, if the people sitting around it are finally willing to tell each other the truth. Eleanor is asleep upstairs in the room that used to be Corey's, the same room I used to stand in the doorway of when he was small, checking that he was breathing the way new mothers do a habit I never fully lost even decades later, apparently, now that I'm checking on a granddaughter instead of a son. Harlow is downstairs right now finishing the dishes from tonight's dinner, and in a few minutes, Corey's going to come find me and tell me it's getting late. And I'm going to walk out to my car the way I do most Sunday evenings, full in a way I didn't know how to be full 18 months ago. Grateful for a slap that hurt terribly in the moment, and somehow, against every expectation I had that awful morning, became the thing that finally taught my whole family how to actually tell each other the truth. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, for letting an old woman take the long way around to tell you a story that mattered more to me, I think, than almost anything else I've lived through in these past 71 years. I don't tell it for sympathy, and I don't tell it to make anyone look worse than they actually are. I tell it because I believe deeply that families heal best in the light, out loud, honestly. And I hope that somewhere in all these long, winding words, something in your own family story felt a little less lonely tonight because of it. I think about the version of myself standing at that kitchen window on the morning after the slap, watching the sky turn from navy to gray to pale gold, certain that something had broken in my family that could never be fully repaired. I wish I could reach back through all these months and tell her what I know now, that the breaking wasn't the end of the story, only the middle of it, and that the parts still waiting to be written were going to ask more patience and more honesty of her than she'd ever had to offer anyone before, but that they would eventually give back far more than they took. I couldn't tell her that then. None of us ever get to know in the middle of our hardest mornings how the story actually ends. We only get to decide one choice at a time, what kind of person we're going to be while we wait to find out. I raised my son alone out of 2 jobs and quiet determination, and I have spent the last year and a half learning that raising a family doesn't ever really stop, not when the children grow up, not when they marry, not even when they hand you a granddaughter to hold on a Sunday afternoon. You just keep raising it. Keep tending it. Keep choosing. Again and again, whether to build something honest or something merely comfortable. I chose honest. It cost me a difficult year. It gave me back a whole family, wider and sturdier than the one I started with. And I would make that same choice again without a moment of hesitation, even knowing everything it was going to ask of me before it finally settled into peace. That's the whole story, start to finish, exactly as it happened, exactly as I lived it. A slap at a breakfast table on the 3rd day of a marriage. A silence that hurt worse than the slap itself, and a long, patient, honest road that led eventually to a kitchen full of laughter, a granddaughter named after my own mother, and a family that finally learned how to tell each other the truth. If there is one thing I want you to carry with you after tonight, more than any single detail of what happened at that breakfast table, it is this. Never let fear talk you out of loving someone fully. But never let love talk you out of protecting yourself either. Those 2 things are not opposites, no matter how often they get treated that way. I loved Harlow enough to give her every chance to become the person she was capable of becoming. And I protected myself enough, quietly, calmly, with a folder of facts and a lawyer's steady advice, to make sure that love was never allowed to be used against me while I waited to see whether she'd take that chance. Both of those things lived in me at once, the whole way through. And I believe, looking back now, that holding both is exactly what let this story end the way it did. Instead of ending the way so many stories like it end, in silence, in distance, in a family quietly falling apart at a breakfast table, nobody ever spoke honestly about again. Corey just walked in to tell me it's getting late, the same way I knew he would. And Eleanor is stirring upstairs, which means it's time for me to say goodnight to all of you, the way I say goodnight to my own family most evenings now. Full, grateful, and a little tired in the good way. The way you're tired after a day spent building something worth having instead of merely surviving one. Before I go, I want to say one more small thing. because I think it matters as much as anything else I've told you tonight. Healing a family doesn't happen because one dramatic dinner reveals the truth and everyone hugs it out by dessert. It happens in 100 small, unglamorous Tuesdays afterward. Coffee shared over a kitchen table, a recipe taught patiently to someone who once criticized your cooking, a phone call made just to talk instead of just to manage a conflict. If you're waiting for the big dramatic turning point to fix your family, I hope you find it the way I found mine that evening, with the pie half eaten and the folder open on the table. But I hope you also understand that the turning point is only ever the beginning of the actual work, not the end of it. And the real proof of healing lives in all those small, quiet Tuesdays that come stacking up quietly afterward, one on top of another, until one day you look up and realize the family sitting around your table feels nothing at all like the one that once frightened you to sit across from. I want to thank every single one of you for sitting here with me tonight, all the way through, from that first cold morning at the breakfast table to this quiet, grateful evening in my own kitchen with my granddaughter asleep upstairs. Stories like this one only really matter when they're shared, when they travel from one kitchen table to another, one family to another, reminding all of us that we are never quite as alone in our hardest moments as we feel while we're living through them. So before you go, I would love to know a little about you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and put your city down in the comments below, because I read every single one of them. And I love knowing just how far these stories travel from this little kitchen of mine. And if you love your own grandmother, if she's still here with you, or if she's the kind of person you carry with you even after she's gone, do me one small favor before you close this out. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with a friend who might need to hear tonight that patience, honesty, and a little bit of quiet strength can turn even the hardest breakfast table into the beginning of something worth building. Good night, and I'll see you all again very soon. Take care of the people who raised you, and take care of yourselves too, because both of those things, held together with patience and honesty, are what actually build a family strong, enough to survive its hardest mornings and come out the other side even closer than before. That is my whole story, told exactly as I lived it. And I hope you carry a piece of it with you tomorrow morning, when you sit down at your own breakfast table with the people you love most in this world. Hold the people you love close. Tell them the truth even when it costs you something in the moment. And never be afraid to give a family the time it needs to heal properly, because the ones truly worth keeping will always meet you halfway when you finally do. Good night from my kitchen to yours, and thank you truly for staying until the very end. Sleep well.